We will talk about the BRICS summit. Now, the 11th summit of BRICS, which comprises of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is being held this week in Brazil. And this grouping represents almost half of the world's population and has a combined GDP of more than 16 trillion US dollars. While economic growth and innovative future are the focus areas for this summit, leaders of these five nations are also expected to discuss other issues like fight against organized crime, counter-terrorism, money laundering, scientific and technical cooperation, as well as a digital economy. So what is in it for India, and how does the decisions arrived at the summit may affect India in the long term and in short term as well? For more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of guests in the studio today. Let me first introduce the guests, beginning with Professor Gulshan Sachdeva from School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. We also have with us former Ambassador Gurjeet Singh with us, and Mr. Pramit Pal Chaudhary, the Foreign Affairs Editor of Hindustan Times, is also with us. Welcome all of you gentlemen to Rajya Sabha TV studios. Let me begin with you, Professor Sachdeva, first, and let's first put the things in perspective for our viewers. There are a lot of issues which are going to be talked about, but the first and foremost question is, why is BRICS, this grouping, so significant?
Well, I mean, this is a very important thing to begin with. As you know, the idea which started from an investment banker, since then, things have changed, world has changed. And at that point of time, the idea was that these are four economies, I mean, South Africa joined later, which are in the next couple of decades, by 2040 and by 2050, these are the countries which are going to be dominating world economy, more than 50%, and all of them non-Western economies. So in a sense, so the way it was presented, it obviously, a lot of attention was kind of, given to this by everybody. Now, since then, I think it has changed. One, that, apart from now, if you look today, Chinese economy is growing around 6%. Indian economy is still growing around 5% plus. But if you look at other three economies, they are doing pretty badly. Russia is close to 1% growth. Brazil, South Africa, less than 1%. And in fact, in the last 20 years, economies of Brazil, South Africa, and Russia, they have actually declined what they were, say, 15, 20 years as a percentage of global economy.
Okay.
So, but at the same time, it's not just only pure economics, because there is also geopolitical angle. If you look Russia, geopolitically, this is very, very important country. Now, all these countries have different political systems. They also have different priorities. But on certain issues, still they come together. What they feel is that can they form certain non-Western norms, a new agenda setting. Now, what actually is happening in BRICS, it's, yes, I mean, the summit meetings are taking place. Formally now, this is going to be 11th one. Couple of years, they had informal meetings. But I think what is really happening now in the last couple of years, many things are happening at a non-summit level. Because every year, whenever you have a presidency country, whichever country is, you have more than 100 meetings are taking place every year. And out of that, I think 15 to 20 are at the ministerial level. So a lot of things are happening between four countries. What they are trying to do, because even if there are serious tensions between, say, India and China, and there are other kind of issues between different countries, but still on certain broader issues, whether this is climate change, sustainable development goals, or international terrorism, what they are trying to do, in a way, trying to set some kind of non-Western agenda. Now, it's a very vague term, but still, I think this is what they are trying to achieve for the last 5-10 years now.
Okay, so they are on the way to go ahead and achieve those targets between themselves. So let me bring in Mr. Singh here. Mr. Singh, from your perspective, there have been 10 summits. This is the 11th one. So if we look at what has happened in the past and what is on the agenda right now, how tangible has been the outcomes of the previous summits as well? And in this, if we look at specifically where there's a lot of talk about future innovation or digital economy or counter-terrorism being the focus areas, key areas. So how do you see things moving from here?
I think if you were to give a BRICS report card, I think it would be pretty like an A minus. The things are getting there, and as Professor Sachdeva has explained, there were reasons why BRICS came forward, but most of the reasons were an elimination of other reasons than positive reasons to keep you together. For instance, the 5 BRICS countries were actually the non-G7 countries who were still important in G20. And not to forget that India had a Russia, India, China mechanism at the level of foreign ministers, which still exists. And we had IPSA, the India, Brazil, South Africa mechanism, which was also meant to be at the foreign minister level. But Brazil always liked to have summits. So these two coalesced into the BRICS, and also that led to the inclusion of South Africa. So this was like bringing these two processes together, though they weren't really complementary, but there we were. Now, if you look at the agenda, I think there are 2 important reports will be submitted at this summit. One is the report of the New Development Bank, popularly called the BRICS Bank. And the second is the report of the BRICS Business Alliance. Now, if you look at the figures, the BRICS countries among them have only 17% of world trade. So I don't think that is something that we are doing greatly well on. So therefore, the BRICS Business Alliance really needs to look at what can be done between these large economies to arrange complementarities, to open doors, but then you come on to the same wall, what will India and China do together? And that is always an issue. India and Russia trying to do more, India, South Africa trying to do more, and India, Brazil trying to do more. India, China, India wants to do more, China always resisting till it's on their own way. So there are limitations on that.
Okay.
Similarly, on the New Development Bank, I think the New Development Bank has been a positive thing, but has it achieved as much as we anticipated? Partly its own limitation. It's only supposed to lend to the same 5 countries, whereas the AIIB, which China has set up, has had a far bigger remit. And I think therefore that bank's role and how it can be speeded up is something that we would need to look at very closely following the summit.
Okay, so that will be one of the important things to watch out for. Pramit, your views on the journey so far and the agenda for this particular summit?
See, the BRICS, I would argue, has, besides what has already been mentioned, 2 primary faults and 2 primary positives, if you wish. On the positives, I think we have seen that for a lot of the governments involved, the 5 governments mentioned, the BRICS, whatever else has captured, if you wish, media and popular imagination. So if you are, as a Prime Minister of India, for example, you decide that you don't want to invest too much more in the non-aligned movement because it's effectively an organization whose purpose and structure has now become so ambiguous that it's just a name. But you want to maintain the posture that you are not completely going to the West or going to China, the BRICS is useful politically for you. It's noticeable that this is true even for countries like China. It's definitely true for Brazil's and South Africa's, but even China. For example, I was at the BRICS summit the BRICS meeting that was held in Mexico on the sidelines of the G20 summit. The IMF at that point, this is during the Eurozone crisis, the IMF had asked China and asked the BRICS countries, would you be prepared to donate to the so-called Great Firewall, which was a giant amount of money that the billions of dollars which the IMF was building up as a hedge against a European financial crisis. China, which was the obvious country because it's the wealthiest, tried to donate but had fierce opposition publicly within China against the idea of donating money to help rich white people, was basically the demand. So the Chinese proposed at the BRICS summit, they said, look, at the BRICS meeting, why don't we donate together as a BRICS group? We'll give half the money, the rest of you give as much as you can. And let's see what our public response was. And the public response was positive. The Chinese didn't mind China giving it as a BRICS proposal. They opposed it as giving a bilateral China-IMF proposal. So it clearly has some political utility for a lot of these leaders. Second, I think the other positive element of this is that at least because of the recognition that there may be some gains within the BRICS, you're having things like the BRICS business visa. South Africa, for example, has a special business visa for BRICS citizens. Now, China's benefited the most, but it's much easier for us to travel now to within these countries. Again, China's benefited the most, but there are some minor changes going on within the BRICS countries. And these are countries, let's say Brazil and India, which have had almost no real business relationship whatsoever. Brazil and Russia have never had any serious business relationship. So at least their thinking makes them think slightly differently. The negatives, however, and this has been mentioned, is that within the BRICS, China dominates. I mean, China is bigger in GDP, in trade terms, than all of the other BRICS countries put together. And this makes BRICS difficult for countries like India, to even to some extent Russia, to handle because China's domination.
Okay.
To put it another way, all of the BRICS countries trade more with China than any of them do with each other.
Each other.
So trade within the BRICS is basically a spoken hub. It's just China and then spokes going to the other countries, but nothing really connecting the other parts, the other four members of the BRICS.
Okay.
So that's one of the key problems we face with the BRICS. And I think the second part of it is the geopolitics. We don't have a common geopolitical position. India has no real interest in Latin America. Brazil has no interest in the Indo-Pacific. Russia and China have now become very close to each other. But South Africa really has is a regional player, but it has no global standing really of any consequence. So geopolitically, it's been very difficult to put the BRICS together, and that remains one of the biggest problems we face there.
Okay, so those are the problems and the positives there as well. Ambassador Singh, you want to say something? You want to add in?
Okay, first, regarding what Mr. Pal Chaudhary said, I think what you will see from now is an India's initiative towards Latin America. I think 2020 is going to be a time when you'll see India moving a little more clearly towards Latin America.
And we have had some high profile visits in the
And
past
I think
as well.
the talk that President Bolsonaro may be the chief guest for the Republic Day. But I think more than that is going to happen. But having said that, you see, he correctly mentioned geopolitics. So I think in BRICS, which originally started as an economic idea, is today becoming a coordination place for some kind of non-economic issues. And I think two of the ones which are most significant for us in this summit, one is the coordination on terrorism and counter-terrorism, and the second one is on reformed multilateralism. I think these are the two most important things, and I'll be happy to elaborate them.
Okay, we'll come to that as well, but first let me bring in Professor Sachdeva here on this very interesting aspect which both Mr. Singh and Pramit is also pointing out, that it started, and you also said it started as a, on the economic agenda, but now the non-economic issues, specifically from the geopolitical perspective, seeming to dominate the scenario or the discussions within the BRICS as well. So how do you see things moving from here onwards on these two aspects? Because it looks like, all these five nations will have to do more on the economic front as well.
Well, that's true, but I don't think geopolitics is dominating economics, but only thing what has happened is that geopolitics has also become an important part of BRICS. Still, it's an economic grouping, and in fact, if you look at about all the 30 sectoral meetings, which actually all the dialogues which have been taking place over the years, most of them are actually about economics. You look at energy, you look at climate change, you look at so many other issues, technology, science and technology. Now so many other new issues will come, future technologies, etc. So these are economic issues. But what perhaps BRICS is trying to do is, as I said, trying to set agenda which is slightly, because another important aspect is that all these five players, nobody wants to throw away all the existing global institutions, whether we are talking about global development architecture or global financial architectures. Only thing is that somehow they are trying to reform those systems in a way that it should also reflect non-Western part of the world.
Okay.
Now within BRICS, as rightly mentioned, this China, which of course has to dominate because it's a larger economy. So long as China is continuing to grow the way it's growing. But now I think India has also started playing a reasonably important role within this. And because this is a kind of a non-Western, as I said, grouping, most of the countries within BRICS, when you had the Russia presidency, they started even civil society dialogues within BRICS, which actually many of them, I mean, otherwise would be, we will be thinking that these countries will not be very comfortable. But since then, civil BRICS has also become very important pillar of, different BRICS meetings. Now, maybe there is also, many people are talking, there is a need to expand, because unless there is economic dynamism, now we only have two economies, as I said, even those two economies also to some extent slowing down. So there is a talk that why don't you bring Indonesia into this, why don't you bring Vietnam into this, because these are the countries which are doing much better than in fact many other countries within these groupings. I think those kind of discussions will continue.
Okay.
But the geopolitics, yes, but geopolitics is happening everywhere. But within this, I think geopolitics is still they are comfortable. I would say, international terrorism, this is one issue which I don't think there's any major problem within BRICS in any of those meetings. And if you look at comfort level, you can see all the last 6-7 declarations which has come from BRICS meetings, all of them are more than 100 paragraphs. It means everything, whatever you can think of, is actually listed there. So it means there is a possibility all these countries feel that they can work together in any of those areas.
Okay. Ambassador Singh, moving away from the limitations now and coming to the core agenda, you've touched all three of you on that aspect as well, but two things which you raised, specifically the counterterrorism and the multilateralism. So these two, you say, are important to India. How and why?
Well, I think it requires no gainsaying that dealing with terrorism is at the top of the Indian agenda.
Okay.
So I think wherever we go, Prime Minister always brings us to the top. And I think he has successfully brought this into the BRICS agenda. Now, there is a BRICS joint working group on terror. Now, what is going to happen at this time is that there will be 5 subcommittees set up. One dealing with radicalization, one dealing with capacity, foreign terrorist fighters, terrorist financing, and one with cyber terrorism. Now, when the BRICS NSAs met, the Indian NSA had proposed a workshop on digital forensics. So I believe that India will be the chair of the cyber terrorism subcommittee, and we will give it a focus to take it on from there and bring in new ideas. Now, I think this also leaves scope for innovation, which is what the summit also focuses on.
Future innovation.
Yes, so I think this BRICS, the innovative BRICS line that is going to come will also go into cyber security, and you mentioned earlier money laundering, drugs, all the non-traditional threats get encapsulated here, and much more than simply say capacity building. It is the cyber security part which is extremely important.
Okay.
And I think the one on radicalization is also something we are deeply interested in. And if we can get these going, then it is a slight victory for us, because even in the summit that was held in Goa, the Chinese always resisted naming certain organizations. But I think now we have decided to go beyond that, because I think we have named them in the UN. So now the idea is to get going on actual cooperation. And since India, China and Russia are already doing this under the SCO, I think therefore this becomes a little bit easier.
Okay. Pramit, science, technology, cooperation, innovation, future, digital economy as well, and obviously counterterrorism and the other issues with respect to the security scenario. All these seemingly are of key interest to India.
Well, let's put it this way. The BRICS, there's a lot of synergies between these countries, or at least lumps within the 2 or 3 of these countries, which we are not completely familiar with. And it's a part of the process. The BRICS helps us a degree of understanding or coming to realize what we do. As I've mentioned, a lot of these countries had almost no relationship. Brazil and Russia don't deal with each other very much, and we presume they've discovered new things thanks in part to the BRICS. But a simple example of how this can work. The Gates Foundation and a number of large philanthropies involved with the HIV/AIDS Africa program, in which subsidized or free medicines are given to AIDS patients in Africa. They realized that this entire HIV/AIDS program was fundamentally built around Chinese drug chemicals being sent to India, being processed through Indian pharma companies, and then being sent on to Africa, often with Gates money paying for this. But they also realized that India and China had a testy relationship, but had never bothered to realize their importance in any of this. So they went to the Indian government and to to some Indian individuals and said, look, can you formalize this relationship? Because right now, if India and China, for example, for some reason have a trade war, and India says, oh, we're not going to allow Chinese bulk chemicals to come into the country for 4 months, the entire HIV AIDS program in Africa collapses. Literally will fall apart. There's nobody to replace this. And within that, obviously, South Africa is a major beneficiary. So they went to the BRICS summit and they said, can we introduce this? And most of the BRICS countries had no idea. They're like, oh, we hadn't even realized that this was going on, or this was so important for you. So fair enough. And you saw 2 or 3 summits ago, they announced there'll be a BRICS health ministers meeting. Yeah. And one of the results of that was to formalize this relationship and recognize the BRICS' special role in helping and sustain this. And I remember the Gates Foundation then made a presentation and they said, the BRICS doesn't even realize it, but the aid programs of China, India, Brazil and Russia, but really those first 3, is so large that it has already overtaken almost all of the G7 countries, including the Italies, the Frances, and the Canadas, in terms of aid programs, are actually by themselves some of the largest aid programs in the world today.
Okay, so in that direction, in fact, the agenda for this summit also talks about agreement to establish the Women Business Alliance. So that will also be one step further. Last, coming to you, Professor Sachdeva, from the Indian perspective, as both Mr. Singh and Pramit is pointing out, and you also pointed out, well, yes, there are limitations, but there are commonalities as well between all these 5 countries. What are the key focus areas which you believe? Yes, we've talked about counterterrorism, we've talked about multilateralism. These are obviously key issues of interest to India, but what else?
Well, I think major issues are, of course, climate change, where all countries like China and India will have to really play a very, very important role. Second, as Pramit mentioned, there is the issue of international global development architecture, because countries like India and China and even Brazil and South Africa, they are also becoming very, very significant players as well as providing development assistance to other countries. So they can really contribute something to the norms building because they are not members of the OECD DAC. Overall, in fact, the idea of BRICS is that you can have certain new norms, even if BRICS Development Bank is relatively small, I mean, compared to the global finance, but still the kind of norms which you are using, which is much more different than than the other kind of norms which you World Bank, IMF, etc. Because it's not just only about how much you contribute; everybody has an equal share when you are deciding. So it's actually bringing new norms, and and of course the economic dynamism within the BRICS has to continue, because that was the initial push. Why the world started looking at BRICS in the first place anyway. If there is no economic dynamism, anyway people will forget about BRICS. So long as countries like India and China continue to grow, and many others you have to bring into this, those countries which are dynamic now, then of course the relevance of this will continue to grow.
Okay, so economic dynamism seemingly is the key. Thank you so much, Professor Sachdeva, and Mr. Singh and Pramit there as well. Clearly, as our panelists have pointed out,